Hello, my name is Michael Loik, and I'm a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz Department of Environmental Studies. I'm here to tell you about some of the ways by which climate change is affecting the ecology of species, populations, and ecosystems. I'm hoping that by now you've watched the video by Professor Keel about the physical aspects of climate change. Here we begin our discussion by noting that temperatures are rising, sea levels are increasing, the ocean is becoming more acidic, and that climate change is affecting water cycle and the frequency of extreme weather events. So that's just a brief reminder about some of the things that you heard from Jeff Keel's lecture. You may have noticed by now that I'm using this presentation from the National Academy of Sciences about climate change. It provides an overview about the impacts of climate change in the United States, various ecosystems, regions. The kinds of things that I will tell you about today are certainly applicable to other tropical, Arctic, alpine, desert, agricultural, and coastal regions worldwide. Now, organisms are affected by the physical environment and their biological environment. So they're affected by the things like temperature, light, rainfall, if it's an aquatic environment, the salinity of water, the temperature, the oxygen content, the presence of other species, competitors, predators, disease organisms, and beneficial organisms that might provide services like pollination. We're going to talk about a few examples of those kinds of things and how they might be affected by climate change. The kinds of things that we see happening to species, populations, and ecosystems is that we're finding that there are changes in what they do across space and across time. Notice these two first bullet points here. Their ranges are changing, the distribution of organisms, and the timing of their biological activity. Things like when flowers open, when species migrate after the winter, for example. And then we find that other things like their physiology, growth rates, the numbers of individuals in a population, and then larger, more complex things like impacts from wildfire, invasive species, disease, things like that are very important outcomes. We'll talk briefly about the impacts on spatial patterns and then on temporal patterns of activity. And then we'll talk about some specific examples from around the US. So range shifts refers to how organisms are relocating in a manner to try to keep up with their preferred habitat. Species have a certain amount or a certain range of temperatures that they prefer to live in, and often have other requirements like day length or the amount of water for certain kinds of plants. And as the climate changes, as rainfall and temperature patterns change, then the geographic distribution may change as well. So the diagrams on the right-hand side, these maps of the US, show, for example, the changes in the plant cold hardiness zones from the United States Department of Agriculture and the Arbor Day Foundation. I draw your attention, for example, in 1990, there's this large section of very dark blue climate conditions in the very northern tier along the 49th parallel. And then there's this kind of peach color. And if we look 16 years later, we see that the extent of the dark blue has decreased, and the extent of this peach color in Texas, for example, has increased. We would expect that certain organisms might have expanded likewise because these contain the kinds of conditions, these colors refer to conditions that those organisms prefer. So there is in general a poleward towards the North Pole or towards the South Pole in the Southern Hemisphere, a migration of plants and animals, slow movements. as well as an upslope migration to higher elevations. But the complications here, as you note in some of these bullet points, is that some species like long-lived trees, like very tall redwoods that we have on the UC Santa Cruz campus, they don't reproduce very often. And so for their populations to migrate according to their preferred habitat would take a very long time. And the climate's changing faster than that may allow. Likewise, certain species depend on specialized conditions. And the more specialized the conditions are, the chances are that those organisms will be harder hit by climate change. So for example, polar bears require sea ice on which to hunt. And as that becomes less common, they will have to either face new ways of hunting or look for new hunting grounds. Much like the spatial patterns of organisms are being altered by climate change, the timing of certain activities is being affected as well. So many aspects of the ecology of organisms are related to what they do at certain times of the year. So some species hibernate in the winter, and then they come back out of hibernation in the spring at a certain date that may be determined by temperature, day length, the wetting of the soil when snow melts in certain locations. And so we see things like the opening of flowers and the hatching of insects that can serve as pollinators. These are all things that happen on certain dates, typically related to when temperatures and soil moisture are appropriate for biological activity. Lots of organisms migrate, birds and other kinds of organisms, and the timing of those migrations are changing. Many times birds lay eggs at a certain time of the year, and the hatchlings hatch and are able to be fed by the parents at a time when insects are abundant. And many of these factors are reliant on multiple cues from the environment. And a major question is whether the timing of some kinds of organismal biology, such as the opening of flowers, will still match to the timing of other kinds of biological activities, such as the hatching of insects that serve as beneficial pollinators. So let's shift our focus now to looking at some of the impacts in various regions of the US. And we'll start on the West Coast and Pacific coastline. And California, for example, has a very lucrative agricultural industry, and that includes the very famous wine industry in California. And grapes particularly grown for wine, tend to have very specific requirements of temperature, soil, rainfall, humidity, sunlight. And those combinations of conditions are changing. Weather is becoming more variable. We've had major droughts in recent years, and of course, wildfires in the news. And some of these prime agricultural wine regions might no longer be as productive as conditions become warmer and as rainfall becomes more variable and less predictable in the future. Also in California is a very long-term study about this little butterfly called the checker spot butterfly. And the Edith's checker spot butterfly has been monitored for several decades now by scientists from Stanford University. And it's been observed long enough now to be able to note that the population is moving slowly northwards and to higher elevations over the past several decades, possibly in response to many things, but likely in response, at least in part, to a warming and more variable climate. Now, terrestrial systems are not the only ones affected by climate change. The increase in CO2 in the atmosphere is mixing into the ocean, causing the oceans to become more acidic. And there are other effects, in addition to the warming of the surface and the increasing acidity, such as pollution and by plastic, as well as other compounds. And we see a formation of dead zones in certain locations. And in other places, we see species ranges moving northwards, or their migration patterns being affected at very large scales. In western US mountains, we see many organisms that are showing signs of responding to climate change by moving to higher elevations. The American pika is one such notable example, where in some places, these small mammals live at some of the highest elevations of any mammals in North America. And they require very specific kinds of conditions. They don't hibernate in the winter, they stay awake, and they must have their dens filled with plant material, kind of like insulation, and as a source of food to keep them alive. And the snowpack is an excellent insulator, but as weather patterns become more variable and the snowpack is more variable, that insulation function of the snow is less reliable for these small mammals, and they're being forced on the one hand to move to higher elevations because of warming temperatures from lower elevations, but they're also being challenged by running out of habitat or running out of materials with which they can provision their nests in the winter. Warmer temperatures also affect streams and rivers. The amount of oxygen that's available in a stream is a function of temperature. And when temperature gets too high, there's not enough oxygen dissolved in the water to keep fish and other organisms alive. So this will have tremendous impacts on aquatic rivers and lakes and montane ecosystems, and on the kinds of recreational opportunities that these regions provide. As many people know, because it was very prominent in the news in recent years, there's been an increase in the area burned by wildfire. And this is a complex outcome of many different things, including drought that causes trees to be less healthy and thereby unable to protect themselves from insect outbreaks. And these insect outbreaks occur partially because winters are not as cold as they used to be. And those cold winters used to serve as a check on insect populations. Now the insects are able to increase their populations because winters are not as severe. And this combines with summer droughts, making these trees highly vulnerable to attack by the beetles, which cause them to be even more susceptible to dying. And then at that point, they serve as dead fuel for wildfires. So this is one example of complex interactions of climate change affecting wintertime temperatures and summertime rainfall, influencing the vulnerability of trees to drought and to attack by insects that are no longer kept partially unchecked by temperature extremes. Elsewhere in the West, southwestern deserts are being affected by wildfire, in this case through invasive species becoming established in places where they never occurred in the past. Sometimes these grasses come from places in Asia or Europe. We see a couple of them listed here, red brome or buffalo grass, and what they do is they serve as a fine fuel in these regions, in these parts of the country that don't have a lot of wildfire back before Europeans arrived in these systems. These grasses have moved in and transformed these ecosystems into those that are vulnerable to fire, which often heavily impacts the species, the native species that in many cases don't have a lot of adaptations for responding to wildland fire. In this image, we see an example from New Mexico and Arizona where forests have undergone large-scale transitions due to drought and wildfire and beetle attack that has a climate change component, but obviously other factors that are affecting these ecosystems. In Alaska and Arctic regions in general are being heavily impacted by climate change, and they've warmed more than most of the ecosystems in the lower 48. The loss of sea ice is especially problematic for certain species like walruses and polar bears that require that as a certain kind of a specialized habitat for various of their behaviors, whether it's hunting or resting or to provide safe places where females can nurse their offspring. This requires these organisms to move elsewhere to look for suitable habitat, to change their behaviors, to alter their physiology, or to go locally extinct. And there's only a handful of different opportunities that these organisms can utilize to cope with a changing climate and the loss of their sea ice. In many parts of Alaska, the permafrost is melting. This is changing the water and carbon dynamics of these ecosystems. There are other changes going on as well, such as expansion of shrublands in places that used to be covered with a very short-statured ecosystem called tundra. But as the permafrost melts and the soils change in nature, and as the snow and rainfall patterns change, we're finding that shrubs are able to establish in places where they used to not be able to do that. This crowds out the kinds of food that their caribou rely on, lichens, which are a combination of fungi and algae. The shrubs also act like miniature little snow fences, and they create snow drifts, which makes it hard for the caribou to find lichens during the winter, but it also creates conditions that allows for even more shrubs to establish and take a root hold in places where they used to previously not occur. Large regions of the central US have been converted from prairie to agricultural lands. Climate change will impact the ability of those agricultural regions to stay productive in a large number of ways. Increasing heat waves will challenge crop survival, as will flooding and other forms of extreme weather like hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires in various other parts of the country. In the spring of 2019, we are seeing the impacts of a very rapid melt of the snow and ice pack on rivers and farmlands in the central US, flooding the major rivers and having lasting impacts on these regions. The elevated carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from our greenhouse gas emissions may actually improve crop production, but on the other hand, complications from drought or too much rain or insect outbreaks, which may have all of their origins in climate change, may swamp out any beneficial effects from elevated carbon dioxide. Agricultural lands act as ecosystems just like any other kind of land, just like a forest or a desert, or even a city can be thought of as an ecosystem. These agricultural ecosystems often provide opportunities for species that are not related to what's being grown on the land. Here we see images of the so-called prairie potholes, which are very important waterways for bird migration in the spring and in the fall. They provide habitat for birds to stop and rest and feed as they're moving northwards or southwards. changing weather patterns, either increased storminess or droughts, will change the hydrology of these systems and threaten the ability of these systems to be maintained and to be available for these migratory waterfowl. In the southeast, we see impacts from climate change on the ocean and related effects on land. Our example here comes from South Florida and the Everglades National Park at the very tip of South Florida. And Miami is over here on the east coast. We have Lake Okeechobee, and in the region around that large lake is a lot of sugar farming that historically has altered the flow of water from Lake Okeechobee across the land surface and through the Everglades. Has caused a change in the flow regime as well as changes in water temperature and and chemicals in the water, such as phosphorus from the nutrients, the fertilizers that the sugar farms use. And so this has had many impacts on the kinds of species that are located in the Everglades. There's a major effort to restore the Everglades, including things like the Florida panther. And as you might imagine, the influence of a large city like Miami and changing those flow regimes has affected the Everglades and the ability to restore this system. But imagine what a rising sea level might do for the ability of the water to flow from this lake to the south out into the ocean. Sea level rise will have many effects on the coastlines in the southeast. So when hurricanes occur, the storm surge that comes with them will become more problematic, cause greater amounts of damage on coastlines. Barrier islands are important for protecting coastlines, particularly in the southeast US. Sea level rise will break up those barrier islands, reconfigure them, and change their protective nature for the mainland behind them. Coastal ecosystems are essential for protecting our land margins, and they've been transformed immeasurably throughout the US. So maintaining existing natural ecosystems and restoring ecosystems in places where they've been degraded will be really important for increasing our resilience to climate change in the future, particularly what happens on our coastlines. Elsewhere, coral reefs are being affected by multiple stresses associated with climate change. Warming temperatures causes coral bleaching, the loss of the beneficial photosynthetic organisms that live inside the hardened structure of the coral. It's the organisms that provide the coral with their colors are photosynthetic, single-celled, bacteria-like organisms that when the temperature gets too high, they are expelled from the hardened coral structure and they are unable to go back in if temperatures cool. So this has a lasting impact on coral reefs. I mentioned earlier that mixing of carbon dioxide is causing the oceans to acidify. That affects the ability of corals to survive. The sea level is increasing, which also is changing these coral reefs. They're also suffering from the influences of nearby coastal development, the pollution that runs off of terrestrial surfaces, overfishing, and other kinds of exploitation. Numerous stresses on our coral reefs because of climate change. In the Northeast, we've seen examples of fisheries that are being affected by climate change and the warming of waters. Many organisms develop in a way that is they grow and undergo metamorphosis in a way that is entirely dependent upon temperature, and the whether you get males or females in some species depends upon temperature. And as we mentioned earlier, the oxygen content is a function of temperature. And warming waters can sometimes allow disease or pest organisms to thrive, and that these can impact economically important fisheries as well. So that was just a few examples from many regions of the United States of the kinds of ecological impacts of climate change. And what we want to remind everyone is that climate change is only one of many kinds of environmental stresses that organisms and ecosystems face these days. And this is all happening at the same time as the loss of habitat fragmentation, the pollution due to other compounds besides carbon dioxide. There are invasive species being introduced from other parts of the planet, and our native species don't have evolutionary history to compete with those species. There's various forms of overexploitation and overdraft of groundwater resources, and a whole lot more. Before we close, we want to note that the rate of climate change is accelerating. And importantly, we only have a couple of decades to get ahead of the effects of climate change on plants and animals, which include the plants and animals that feed us. And so this is something that everybody should keep in mind as they move forward in their daily lives, is that we should all be acting sooner rather than later to put into place policies and technologies to help us bend the curve of our CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions from rapidly increasing to actually decreasing. How do we do this? Well, there's a risk of getting overwhelmed and becoming depressed. On the other hand, there's an opportunity for everybody to roll up their sleeves and think about what it is that they know how to do and how to put that into action in new ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to change the way that we feed a planet full of almost 9 billion human beings. So the way that we grow our food and how we manage water, how we generate electricity, and how we move ourselves around for work and play, how we release our waste products, how we treat the other species and other habitats on this planet. These are all important ways that we can address climate change. And as I wrap up here, I just want to acknowledge this presentation from the National Academy of Sciences. And there are some details here where you can find more information. Thank you very much for listening.